The sharp crack of flesh meeting flesh echoed like a gunshot across the crystal-lit ballroom. 300 of the city's most dangerous elites froze. Breathing stopped. Clara, a baker who was supposed to be invisible, stood trembling, her hand stinging. Before her stood Dominic Castiglione, a man who ended lives with a whisper. He slowly turned his head back, a red handprint blooming on his jaw. Everyone waited for her execution. Instead, his next move shattered everything they knew. The Grand Astoria Hotel ballroom was a masterclass in opulent deception. Beneath the shimmering teardrops of the imported chandeliers, the room was packed with the city's highest society, politicians, hedge fund managers, and socialites. But anyone who knew the real pulse of Chicago understood that tonight's charity gala for the Tremblay Foundation was merely a velvet curtain hiding the real power brokers. Mayor Richard Tremblay was hosting, but the men who truly owned the room didn't wear mayoral pins. They wore bespoke Italian suits that concealed shoulder holsters, and they operated in the shadows. Clara Higgins cared about none of this. Her only concern was the towering display of white chocolate raspberry truffles that was dangerously close to melting under the relentless glare of the heat lamps. Clara was the owner of Sweet Serenity, a small but fiercely independent catering company that had somehow miraculously landed this gig. She was a woman of generous, soft curves in a room full of sharp angles and starved figures. Her thick, dark hair was pinned back haphazardly, escaping in frizzy tendrils around her face, and her white chef's coat stretched comfortably over her full hips and large bust. Clara had spent her entire life navigating a world that told her she took up too much space. Usually, she compensated with a warm smile and a self-deprecating joke. But tonight, after 14 hours on her feet, her reservoir of patience was running dangerously low. "Clara, Table 4 needs more of the gold leaf tartlets," whispered Sarah Jenkins, Clara's best friend and sous chef, her voice trembling slightly. Sarah's eyes kept darting toward the VIP section, a velvet-roped area guarded by men with thick necks and dead eyes. "Tell Table 4 they can wait 3 minutes while I plate this," Clara muttered, wiping a bead of sweat from her brow with the back of her forearm. The atmosphere in the room shifted abruptly, like a sudden drop in barometric pressure before a violent storm. The low hum of string quartet music seemed to falter. The double mahogany doors at the entrance swung open, and the crowd parted like the Red Sea. Dominic Castiglione had arrived. He was a terrifyingly handsome man, tall and broad-shouldered, radiating an aura of absolute, undisputed authority. As the head of the Castiglione family, Dominic didn't just run the local underworld. He owned the very ground the hotel was built on. His dark eyes swept the room with bored indifference, his sharp jawline set in a permanent scowl of superiority. Flanking him were his top lieutenants, including the notoriously volatile Paulie Gatto and the calculating Vincenzo Russo. The men moved with a predatory grace, clearing a path straight toward the VIP area, which unfortunately intersected right past Clara's dessert station. Clara kept her head down, expertly piping vanilla bean mascarpone onto a tray of delicate pastries. She just wanted to get through the night, collect her 5-figure check, and go home to her cat. But fate, it seemed, had a cruel sense of humor. As Dominic's entourage brushed past the dessert station, Paulie Gatto, distracted by a passing waitress, bumped hard into the edge of Clara's table. The impact sent a meticulously stacked tower of macarons crashing to the marble floor in a tragic explosion of pastel sugar and shattered glass. Clara gasped, dropping her piping bag. Hours of painstaking work lay ruined at the feet of a man who didn't even bother to look down. "Hey!" Clara barked, the word slipping out before her survival instincts could silence her. Paulie stopped, turning slowly. He looked at the crushed pastries, then dragged his eyes up to Clara. A sneer twisted his face. "Watch your tone, sweetheart. You're lucky my suit didn't get stained." "Your suit?" Clara felt the blood rushing to her cheeks, a mix of pure exhaustion and blinding indignation. "You just destroyed 3 hours of my work because you couldn't be bothered to watch where you were going. I expect an apology, and my company expects to be compensated for the damages." The surrounding guests gasped. Sarah violently tugged on the back of Clara's apron, whispering frantically, "Clara, stop! Do you know who they are?" Paulie let out a cruel, barking laugh. He looked Clara up and down, his gaze lingering with blatant disgust on her plus-size figure. "Compensated? Honey, looking at you, I'd say missing a few desserts is the best thing that could happen to your waistline. Back off before I have you thrown out with the rest of the garbage." The insult hit Clara like a physical blow, striking the deepest, most tender insecurities she had battled her whole life. But instead of shrinking, a white-hot fury ignited in her chest. Before she could unleash a verbal tirade, a deep, gravelly voice cut through the tension. "Is there a problem here, Paulie?" Dominic Castiglione stepped forward. The temperature in the immediate vicinity seemed to drop 10 degrees. He didn't look at Clara. He looked at the mess, then back to his lieutenant. "No problem, boss," Paulie sneered. "Just the hired help getting a little too loud. The fat broad doesn't know her place." Dominic finally turned his dark, impenetrable gaze onto Clara. She felt a shiver run down her spine, but she locked eyes with him, refusing to cower. Dominic reached into the breast pocket of his tailored suit, pulled out a silver money clip, and peeled off a crisp $100 bill. With an air of absolute disdain, he flicked the bill toward Clara. It fluttered gracefully in the air before landing on the frosting-covered floor. "Clean it up, take the money, and keep your mouth shut," Dominic ordered, his voice flat, devoid of any emotion. He turned his back on her, fully expecting his command to be obeyed, as it always was. Something inside Clara snapped. It wasn't just about the ruined macarons, or the cruel comment about her weight, or the exhaustion. It was the sheer, suffocating arrogance of a man who believed the world and everyone in it were simply objects to be bought, bullied, or discarded. She stepped over the shattered glass, her non-slip shoes squeaking against the marble. She reached out, grabbed Dominic's broad shoulder, and forcibly spun the Mafia boss around. As he turned, his face registering a fleeting micro-expression of absolute shock at being touched, Clara raised her right hand. Putting her entire body weight behind it, she brought her palm across his perfectly sculpted face with devastating force. Smack! The sound of the slap defied physics. It seemed to bounce off the gilded ceilings, silencing the string quartet, halting the waiters in their tracks, and freezing the breath in the lungs of every single person in the grand ballroom. The $100 bill still lay on the frosting-streaked marble floor, but nobody was looking at the mess anymore. Every eye was locked on the impossible scene unfolding by the dessert station. Time dilated. For Clara, the adrenaline that had propelled her hand forward evaporated instantly, replaced by a cold, leaden terror that settled in the pit of her stomach. Her palm burned with a fiery intensity, a physical testament to the reality of what she had just done. She had just assaulted Dominic Castiglione. Men had been buried in the foundations of the city's skyscrapers for far less. Almost simultaneously, a terrifying chorus of mechanical clicks echoed around Clara. Vincenzo Russo, Paulie Gatto, and 4 other towering bodyguards had drawn their concealed weapons. 6 black muzzles were pointed directly at Clara's chest and head. Sarah Jenkins let out a stifled sob, collapsing to her knees behind the catering table, covering her ears. Mayor Tremblay, standing 20 feet away, turned ash-white and subtly stepped behind a marble pillar. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. She stared at Dominic's face, which was turned sharply to the left from the force of the blow. A stark, vivid red handprint was already beginning to raise against his olive skin. She waited for him to give the nod. She waited for the deafening roar of gunfire that would end her life right there among the shattered pastries. She closed her eyes, a tear squeezing past her lashes, terrified, but somehow fiercely unrepentant. 5 seconds passed, then 10. Hold. The command was spoken softly, barely above a whisper, yet it carried an authority so absolute that it instantly halted the impending violence. Clara slowly opened her eyes. Dominic Castiglione had not moved to strike her. He hadn't signaled his men to fire. Instead, he slowly, deliberately, turned his head back to face her. His dark eyes, which just moments ago had been filled with cold indifference, were now burning with an unreadable, intense fire. He raised a large, immaculately manicured hand and gently touched his stinging cheek. Then, the unthinkable happened. Dominic Castiglione smiled. It wasn't a gentle smile, nor was it a cruel smirk. It was a genuine, dark curve of the lips, accompanied by a low, rumbling chuckle that originated deep within his chest. The sound was so completely out of context that it unsettled his own men. Paulie exchanged a panicked, confused glance with Vincenzo, their guns wavering slightly, but remaining trained on Clara. "Boss?" Vincenzo asked, his voice tight with confusion. "Give the word." Dominic lowered his hand from his face. The smile faded, replaced by an expression of cold, terrifying command. He didn't look at Vincenzo. He kept his eyes locked onto Clara, studying her, taking in her flushed, rounded cheeks, her defiant, terrified eyes, the way she stood her ground despite her obvious fear. "Put the guns away," Dominic ordered, his voice slicing through the tense air. "But boss, she laid hands on you," Paulie protested, taking a step forward. In a blur of motion too fast to track, Dominic pivoted. His fist shot out, burying itself viciously into Paulie's gut. The larger man folded instantly with a choked gasp, dropping his weapon as he crashed to his knees on the marble floor. The rest of the bodyguards immediately holstered their weapons, taking synchronized steps backward, their heads bowed in submission. Dominic stood over the wheezing Paulie, adjusting his cuffs with terrifying calm. "When I give an order, Paulie, I don't expect a debate. You disrespected this woman. You destroyed her work. And then you embarrassed me by making a scene over a tray of cookies." He grabbed a fistful of Paulie's expensive suit jacket and hauled the gasping lieutenant to his feet. "Apologize to her." Paulie, his face purple, spat blood onto the floor. He looked at Clara with pure, unadulterated hatred, but the grip on his collar tightened. "I'm sorry," he wheezed out. "And?" Dominic prompted, his voice a dangerous purr. "And I will pay for the damages," Paulie choked. Dominic released him, letting the man stumble backward into Vincenzo's arms. "Get out of my sight. Wait in the car." As the bruised lieutenant was dragged away, Dominic turned his attention back to Clara. The room was still holding its collective breath. Clara's legs felt like jelly, ready to give out at any moment. She had prepared for death. She had no idea how to process this bizarre twist. Dominic took a slow, deliberate step toward her, entirely ignoring the chaotic mess of ruined desserts between them. He stopped mere inches from her, forcing Clara to tilt her head up to maintain eye contact. Up close, she could smell his cologne, a heady mix of cedar, bergamot, and danger. He looked down at her, his eyes tracing the soft curve of her jaw, the fullness of her lips, and the fierce intelligence shining in her tear-filled eyes. In a world where everyone bowed, scraped, and starved themselves to appease him, this soft, beautiful, furious woman had stood tall and demanded respect with the palm of her hand. "What is your name?" Dominic asked, his tone entirely stripped of its earlier arrogance, replaced by a genuine, consuming curiosity. "Clara," she stammered, hating the slight tremor in her voice. "Clara Higgins." Dominic slowly reached down, bypassed the $100 bill on the floor, and instead picked up one of the few surviving macarons that had rolled onto a clean patch of marble. He held it up, inspecting the delicate gold leaf on the shell. He took a bite. Clara watched, dumbfounded, as the Mafia boss chewed slowly, his eyes never leaving hers. "You make a good pastry, Clara Higgins," he said softly, swallowing. He took a step closer, his voice dropping so low that only she could hear it. "But you have a terrible sense of self-preservation." He pulled out a sleek, matte black business card and gently tucked it into the front pocket of her flour-dusted chef's coat. His knuckles brushed lightly against the curve of her breast, sending an involuntary jolt of electricity straight down her spine. "Pack up your equipment," Dominic murmured, his dark eyes burning into hers with a promise that terrified and thrilled her in equal measure. "You don't work for the Tremblay Foundation anymore. As of tonight, you work exclusively for me. I expect you at my estate tomorrow at 8 in the morning. Don't be late." Without another word, Dominic Castiglione turned on his heel and walked toward his VIP table, leaving the entire ballroom and Clara Higgins completely and utterly speechless. The morning sun felt excessively bright, almost mocking, as Clara Higgins stared at the matte black business card resting on her scratched Formica kitchen counter. Embossed in minimalist silver lettering was a single phone number and an address located in the ultra-exclusive, heavily wooded enclaves of Lake Forest, Illinois. Clara had spent the entire night pacing the cramped floor of her apartment, her mind spiraling through a dozen different escape plans. She had Googled one-way flights to Seattle, considered packing her rescue tabby cat, Barnaby, into her battered Ford Fiesta and disappearing into the Pacific Northwest. But every terrifying late-night Google search about the Castiglione family yielded the same chilling conclusion: you do not run from Dominic Castiglione. If he wanted to find you, the earth itself would offer you up. At 7 a.m., Clara finally stopped pacing. She looked at her reflection in the hallway mirror. Her eyes were bloodshot, her dark, frizzy hair tamed into a tight, severe bun. She smoothed down her clean chef's coat over her generous hips and full bust, taking a deep, shuddering breath. She was a woman who had built her life on taking up space unapologetically, fighting for every inch of respect in the cutthroat Chicago culinary scene. She refused to let a man in a bespoke suit, even a deadly one, make her cower in her own skin. By 7:55 a.m., Clara's Ford Fiesta was idling in front of a pair of towering wrought-iron gates that looked like they belonged to a European fortress. A discreet security camera whirred, focusing on her windshield. Seconds later, the heavy gates swung open with a silent, imposing grace, revealing a winding driveway lined with centuries-old oak trees. The Castiglione estate was a sprawling, modern architectural marvel of glass, dark stone, and severe geometric lines. Parked in the circular driveway was a fleet of black SUVs, alongside a sleek silver Aston Martin DBS Superleggera. Waiting for her on the front steps was Vincenzo Russo. Without the distraction of the ballroom chaos, Clara realized just how dangerous the man looked. His suit was immaculately tailored, concealing the lethal weaponry beneath, and his eyes were completely devoid of warmth. "Miss Higgins," Vincenzo said smoothly, opening the heavy glass front door. "Punctual. Mr. Castiglione appreciates that. Follow me." Clara gripped the handle of her worn leather knife roll, the leather comforting against her sweaty palms. She followed Vincenzo through a cavernous foyer adorned with museum-quality modern art. The sheer wealth of the place was suffocating. They bypassed grand living spaces and descended into what Clara quickly realized was the heart of the estate. The kitchen. But calling it a kitchen was a gross understatement. It was a culinary cathedral. The centerpieces were twin, custom-built La Cornue Grand Palais ranges in matte black and brass. The countertops were vast expanses of imported Calacatta marble, and the walk-in refrigerators were the size of Clara's entire apartment. Standing beside the massive marble island, pouring a cup of dark coffee, was Dominic Castiglione. He was dressed down, though the term was relative. He wore a crisp, charcoal dress shirt with the sleeves rolled up to his forearms, revealing a complex web of dark, intricate tattoos creeping up from his wrists. The bruises from Clara's slap were completely invisible, but as he turned to look at her, she felt the phantom sting in her palm all over again. "Vincenzo, leave us," Dominic commanded softly. The lieutenant vanished like a ghost, the heavy doors clicking shut behind him. Clara stood frozen, clutching her knife roll to her chest like a shield. Dominic took a slow sip of his coffee, his dark eyes raking over her form. He didn't look at her the way other men did, with dismissal or cruel judgment regarding her weight. His gaze was heavy, calculating, and undeniably appreciative of the soft, commanding presence she brought into his austere home. "I wasn't sure you'd show up," Dominic finally spoke, his voice a low baritone that seemed to vibrate against the marble walls. "Half of me expected my men to find you at O'Hare International Airport, trying to board a flight to somewhere rainy." "I thought about it," Clara admitted, her voice remarkably steady despite the frantic beating of her heart. "But I figured your reach is longer than my gas mileage." A ghost of a smile tugged at the corner of Dominic's mouth. He set his coffee cup down and walked toward her. Clara forced herself not to step back. "I fired my executive chef last night," Dominic stated casually, stopping 3 feet away from her. "Armand Girard. He had a Michelin star, an ego the size of this estate, and a nasty habit of skimming off the grocery budget to fund his gambling debts. I don't tolerate thieves, and I certainly don't tolerate bad food." Clara blinked, thrown entirely off balance. "You brought me here to cook?" "I brought you here because you are entirely authentic, Clara," Dominic said, taking a step closer, the scent of bergamot and danger wrapped around her. "In my world, everyone wears a mask. Everyone lies. Everyone is terrified. But you stood in front of a man who could have you erased from existence, and you struck me because I insulted your work. You demand respect." He reached out, his long, calloused fingers gently tracing the leather of her knife roll. "I'm hosting the heads of the 5 New York families this weekend. It is the most critical summit this syndicate has seen in a decade. I need an executive chef I can trust. Someone who won't be easily intimidated, bribed, or frightened by the men sitting at my table. I want you to run this kitchen." Clara's mouth went dry. "I own a small catering business. I make pastries and comfort food. I don't cook for Mafia summits." "You do now," Dominic corrected softly, his tone leaving absolutely no room for debate. "You will be paid triple what Gerard made. You will have unlimited resources, the finest ingredients in the world, and absolute authority over the kitchen staff. But make no mistake, Clara. If you accept this, you are stepping into a war zone. Are you strong enough to handle my world?" Clara looked around the magnificent kitchen, then back into the dark, bottomless eyes of the most dangerous man in Chicago. A terrifying, thrilling spark of ambition ignited in her chest. She had spent her life being underestimated. This was her chance to command the absolute best. "I'll need pure Nielsen Massey vanilla, unrestricted access to the local organic markets, and my sous chef, Sarah," Clara said, lifting her chin defiantly. Dominic's genuine, dark smile returned. "Done. Welcome to the family, Clara." Taking control of the Castiglione kitchen was like trying to tame a pack of feral wolves while covered in raw meat. The existing staff, deeply loyal to the exiled chef Gerard, viewed Clara with a toxic mixture of disdain and outright rebellion. They looked at her soft, full figure and her lack of fine dining pedigree, and they saw weakness. They were incredibly mistaken. By her 3rd day, Clara had established an iron-fisted rhythm. When the saucier accidentally scorched a delicate veal demi-glace, Clara didn't yell. She calmly dumped the entire 40-quart stock pot down the drain, handed the man a scrub brush, and made him start over while she flawlessly executed the backup sauce herself. When the pastry chef mocked her weight in rapid-fire French, assuming she couldn't understand, Clara fired him on the spot in perfectly accented Parisian French, replacing him with a terrified but eager line cook. She moved through the massive kitchen with a dancer's grace, her lush curves swaying as she commanded the space, wielding her razor-sharp Wusthof chef's knife with terrifying precision. Unbeknownst to Clara, Dominic often watched her from the shadowed mezzanine overlooking the kitchen. He was mesmerized. In a life defined by violence, blood, and cold calculation, Clara was a beacon of warmth and creation. He watched the way she tasted sauces, closing her eyes in pure sensory ecstasy. He watched the way her thick thighs pressed against the counters as she kneaded dough, her chest heaving with exertion, her face flushed and beautiful. She was a goddess of hearth and survival, completely incongruous with his dark reality, yet exactly what he craved. The tension in the estate reached a boiling point on Friday evening. The summit was commencing. The dining room was filled with the most ruthless men on the eastern seaboard, including the notoriously treacherous Don Lombardi of the Brooklyn faction. The air was thick with cigar smoke, veiled threats, and millions of dollars in illegal negotiations. In the kitchen, the pressure was suffocating. Clara was plating the 2nd course, a delicate pan-seared sea scallops dish with a saffron-infused citrus beurre blanc. The plates were lined up in perfect military precision. The servers, men with hidden holsters under their vests, stood ready to run the food. "Sauce the plates!" Clara barked, her forehead shining with sweat, stray curls sticking to her cheeks. Her new sous chef, a quiet young man named Leo, hurried forward with the copper saucepan of beurre blanc. As he began to drizzle the vibrant yellow sauce over the scallops, Clara's sharp eyes caught a minute detail. The sauce looked slightly separated, lacking the glossy, perfect emulsion she had achieved just 10 minutes ago when she left it on the warming shelf. "Stop!" Clara commanded, grabbing Leo's wrist. "Chef," Leo asked, his eyes wide with panic. "The servers have to go. Mr. Castiglione hates waiting." Clara ignored him. She dipped a clean tasting spoon into the copper pot. She brought it to her lips, letting the sauce hit her palate. Instantly, her culinary instincts screamed in alarm. Beneath the rich butter, the floral saffron, and the bright acid of the lemon, there was a harsh, metallic astringency. It was incredibly faint, masked brilliantly by the citrus, but it was there. It tasted like bitter almonds and rust. It wasn't a cooking error. It was poison. Clara's blood ran cold. She spun around, her eyes scanning the chaotic kitchen. Who had been near the warming shelf? The delivery boys, one of the newly hired prep cooks. There was no time to figure it out. 4 plates had already been sourced, and a server was hoisting the heavy silver tray onto his shoulder, turning toward the swinging doors that led to the dining room. The plate at the front of the tray, adorned with a specific sprig of micro-cilantro, was designated for the head of the table. Dominic's plate. "Don't take that out!" Clara shouted, her voice echoing off the tile walls. But the server, a hardened Castiglione soldier, trained to obey only Vincenzo and Dominic, ignored the chef. He pushed through the swinging doors, stepping into the dimly lit, opulent dining room. Clara didn't think. She dropped her tasting spoon and sprinted. She pushed past the stunned kitchen staff, her heavy, non-slip shoes hitting the floorboards hard as she burst through the swinging doors just seconds behind the server. The dining room fell dead silent. 10 of the most dangerous Mafia bosses in the country turned their predatory gazes toward the disheveled, flour-dusted woman who had just violently interrupted their summit. Vincenzo Russo instantly reached inside his jacket, his eyes locked on Clara. Dominic, seated at the head of the long mahogany table, froze. His dark eyes narrowed in confusion and rising anger as Clara practically tackled the server from behind, just as he was lowering the scallop plate toward the table. "Do not eat that!" Clara gasped, her chest heaving, grabbing the edge of the silver tray so violently that the china rattled, and a scallop slid onto the pristine white tablecloth. "What the hell is the meaning of this?" Don Lombardi barked, slamming a heavy, ring-adorned fist onto the table. Dominic stood up slowly, the atmosphere instantly turning lethal. "Clara," he said, his voice a terrifying, quiet rumble. "Explain yourself, now!" Clara stood panting, her full figure trembling, aware that 6 guns were currently aimed under the table at her knees. She looked past the furious rival bosses, locking eyes directly with Dominic. She didn't flinch. "The beurre blanc," Clara said, her voice ringing out, clear and steady, in the silent room. "It's been tampered with. There is a metallic, bitter chemical agent masking the citrus profile. If you take a bite of that scallop, Dominic, you won't live to see the dessert course." A collective gasp echoed through the room. Don Lombardi's face drained of color, while Vincenzo immediately drew his weapon, pointing it directly at the terrified server's head. Dominic stared at Clara. He looked down at the ruined plate on the table, then back up at her flushed, desperate face. She had risked her life, burst into a room full of killers, entirely to protect him. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating, until Dominic finally broke it. "Vincenzo," Dominic ordered, his eyes never leaving Clara's, a dark, possessive fire igniting in his gaze. "Lock down the estate, no one leaves, and bring me the man who had access to that source." The heavy mahogany doors of the dining room slammed shut, and the unmistakable sound of deadbolts sliding into place echoed like a gunshot. The grand summit of the most powerful criminal syndicates had instantly transformed into a gilded cage. Vincenzo Russo moved with terrifying efficiency. Within seconds, his men had disarmed the bodyguards of the visiting New York bosses, forcing them against the silk-lined walls. The air in the room grew suffocatingly tight, thick with the smell of expensive cigars, fear, and the sharp tang of adrenaline. "Nobody moves," Vincenzo barked, his silencer-equipped pistol sweeping across the room. Dominic Castiglione remained standing at the head of the table. He did not look at Don Lombardi, who was suddenly sweating profusely, nor did he look at the other enraged bosses. His dark, impenetrable gaze was fixed entirely on Clara. She was trembling slightly, her white chef's coat stained with a smear of saffron sauce, her thick dark hair escaping its bun in wild, frizzy waves. Yet despite her obvious terror, she stood tall, her generous curves planted firmly between Dominic and the poisoned plate. "Bring the kitchen staff," Dominic commanded softly. The quietness of his voice was far more terrifying than any scream. Less than 2 minutes later, the swinging doors burst open. 7 terrified culinary workers were shoved into the dining room by armed guards, including the young sous chef, Leo, and a newly hired prep cook named Toby. They fell to their knees on the imported Persian rug, weeping and begging for their lives. Dominic slowly walked around the edge of the long table. He picked up the silver dessert spoon, resting by his water glass, and scooped up a generous portion of the ruined scallops and beurre blanc. He walked over to the line of kneeling staff. "Someone in this room," Dominic began, his voice echoing off the crystal chandeliers, "attempted to alter the menu tonight. I am a fair man. I will give the architect of this dish the honor of tasting it first." He stopped in front of Toby, the prep cook who had been responsible for organizing the plating station. The young man's face was completely drained of blood. "Open your mouth, Toby," Dominic whispered, holding the spoon out. "No. Please, boss, I swear to God," Toby shrieked, scrambling backward until his back hit the legs of a heavy oak chair. "I didn't want to. They made me. They said they would kill my mother in Queens." "They?" Dominic asked, his head tilting slightly. Toby raised a trembling, flour-covered finger and pointed directly at Don Lombardi. "His men. The Lombardi family. They paid off a guard at the service entrance and gave me a vial. They said it was just a muscle relaxer to make you sick, to humiliate you." Cyanide was not a muscle relaxer. The room erupted. Don Lombardi roared in fury, reaching inside his tailored suit for a hidden derringer. But he was painfully slow compared to the Chicago syndicate. Before Lombardi's gun even cleared his pocket, 3 deafening cracks rang out from Vincenzo's weapon. Lombardi screamed, dropping to the floor as blood rapidly pooled around his shattered kneecaps and his right shoulder. "Take out the trash," Dominic ordered, not even blinking at the bloodshed. "Put Lombardi in the soundproof basement, and take the boy to the gates. Give him $5,000 and tell him if he ever returns to Chicago, I'll bury him." As the screaming, bleeding New York boss was dragged out by his collar, Dominic turned back to the remaining syndicate heads. "This summit is concluded. The Castiglione family will be absorbing the Lombardi territories in Brooklyn. If any of you have an issue with that, you are welcome to join him downstairs. Otherwise, get out of my city." Within 10 minutes, the grand dining room was empty, save for the bloodstains on the Persian rug and the abandoned plates of world-class cuisine. Dominic exhaled a long, heavy breath, running a hand through his dark hair. He turned to Clara, who was leaning heavily against the marble fireplace, clutching her stomach as the adrenaline finally crashed, leaving her violently nauseous. Without a word, Dominic crossed the room. He didn't summon a guard, nor did he ask for permission. He simply scooped Clara up into his arms. She gasped, instinctively wrapping her arms around his broad neck. She was a large, heavy woman, a fact she was painfully aware of every day of her life. But Dominic lifted her with effortless, reverent strength. He carried her out of the dining room, up the grand, sweeping staircase, and into his private master suite. He gently set her down on a massive velvet sofa, then walked over to a crystal decanter, pouring 2 generous glasses of Macallan 1926. He handed one to her, his fingers brushing against hers. "Drink," he urged gently. Clara took a shaky sip, the liquid fire burning down her throat, grounding her. "I ruined the summit," she whispered, a hysterical laugh bubbling up in her chest. Dominic knelt on the floor in front of her. The most feared man in the Midwest was on his knees before a baker. He reached out, his large hands resting on her soft, thick thighs, his thumbs tracing the curve of her hips through the cotton of her chef's pants. "You didn't ruin anything," Dominic said, his voice raw with an emotion Clara had never heard from him. "You saved my life. You stepped in front of a bullet for a man you barely know. Why?" "Because you saw me," Clara answered honestly, her eyes filling with tears. "My whole life, people have looked right past me, or they've looked at me with disgust because I take up too much space. But you didn't. You saw my talent. You saw me." Dominic's jaw tightened. He slid his hands up her waist, pulling her slightly forward until their faces were inches apart. "I see a queen," he murmured fiercely. "I see a woman with more fire and brilliance than anyone in my world. You are magnificent, Clara. Every soft inch of you." He leaned in, capturing her lips in a kiss that tasted of scotch, survival, and a dark, desperate possession. 2 weeks had passed since the bloody disaster of the summit, and the fallout had been catastrophic. The hostile takeover of the Lombardy territories had triggered a massive underground war. But the violence wasn't just contained to the streets. It had seeped into the legitimate, white-collar world. Don Lombardy, it turned out, hadn't acted alone. He had financial backing from a corrupt conglomerate using Deutsche Bank accounts and offshore shell corporations in Bermuda to funnel money to rival hitmen. Worse, they had the political protection of Senator Mitchell, a man who had long wanted the Castiglione family dismantled. Because of the escalating danger, Clara had not left the Lake Forest estate in 14 days. She was effectively a prisoner, albeit one kept in absolute luxury. Dominic had moved her belongings from her cramped apartment into a guest suite adjoining his own master bedroom. Her cat, Barnaby, was now happily shedding orange fur all over Dominic's priceless Persian rugs. Clara spent her days in the culinary cathedral, baking aggressively to manage her anxiety. She churned out dozens of brioche loaves, elaborate croquembouches, and rich dark chocolate tortes. The kitchen staff, having witnessed her fearlessly challenge the Mafia bosses in the dining room, now treated her with a reverence bordering on worship. She wasn't just the executive chef anymore. She was the woman who held the Don's heart. But the Don himself was slipping away. Dominic was leaving earlier and returning later, his handsome face etched with exhaustion and dark bruises. The war was taking a toll. On a stormy Tuesday evening, thunder rattled the floor-to-ceiling windows of the estate. Clara was in the kitchen, meticulously folding butter into croissant dough, when the heavy reinforced doors of the garage flew open. Vincenzo sprinted into the house, his suit soaked in rain and blood. "We need the medical kit, now!" Vincenzo roared, his usual icy composure completely shattered. Clara dropped her rolling pin, leaving a dusting of flour on the Calacatta marble, and ran toward the foyer. 2 massive bodyguards were carrying Dominic through the door. His charcoal suit jacket was shredded, and a terrifying amount of dark blood was soaking through the left side of his crisp white shirt. "Dominic!" Clara screamed, her heart seizing in her chest. They laid him on the massive leather sectional in the living room. "Ambush on the Kennedy Expressway," Vincenzo grunted, frantically ripping Dominic's shirt open to expose the wound. "Senator Mitchell's private security contractors. It's a through-and-through graze on his ribs, but he lost a lot of blood." The estate's private underground doctor was still 20 minutes away. Clara didn't hesitate. She grabbed a stack of clean bar towels from the kitchen and pushed her way past the towering, panicked mobsters. "Move!" she snapped at a bodyguard who hesitated. She dropped to her knees beside the sofa, pressing the thick wad of towels firmly against Dominic's bleeding side. He hissed in pain, his eyes flying open. His skin was pale, stark against his dark hair and tattoos. When his eyes found Clara's terrified, tear-streaked face, his breathing hitched. "I told you to stay in the secure wing," Dominic rasped, lifting a blood-stained hand to cup her soft, full cheek. "And I told you that I don't take orders from men who don't know how to duck," Clara fired back, her voice shaking with a mixture of fear and furious affection. She leaned her entire body weight onto her hands, using her generous size to apply maximum pressure to the wound. For 20 agonizing minutes, she held the makeshift tourniquet, ignoring the blood soaking into her apron, whispering comforting, nonsensical promises to him until the doctor finally burst through the doors. Hours later, the estate was locked down under heavy guard. Dominic was bandaged, heavily stitched, and resting in his massive king-sized bed. The painkillers had taken the edge off his agony, but he refused to sleep. Not until Clara walked through the double mahogany doors. She had showered, washing the blood from her skin, and was wearing a soft, oversized silk robe that clung to her lush curves. She carried a tray with a bowl of rich, slow-simmered chicken and wild rice soup. Dominic watched her walk toward him, his dark eyes tracking the gentle sway of her hips. He felt an overwhelming, crushing wave of emotion that he had spent his entire life suppressing. In his brutal world, attachments were liabilities. Love was a weapon used against you. But looking at Clara, he realized he was already fatally compromised. She set the tray on the nightstand and sat on the edge of the mattress. "You need to eat," she murmured, picking up the spoon. Dominic weakly pushed the spoon away, his hand capturing hers. His grip was surprisingly strong. "I don't want food, Clara. I want you to listen to me. You shouldn't be talking. You need to rest. Listen," he commanded softly, pulling her hand to his lips and pressing a feverish kiss against her knuckles. "Senator Mitchell and the offshore accounts. Vincenzo is neutralizing them tonight. By morning, the war will be over. The syndicate will be undisputed." He shifted, wincing slightly as his stitches pulled, but he refused to let go of her hand. "When I brought you here, I told myself it was because I needed a chef I could trust. That was a lie. I brought you here because the moment you slapped me in that ballroom, I knew you were the only real, uncompromising thing I had ever encountered. You didn't cower. You didn't shrink yourself to fit into my world. You demanded that I see you." Tears spilled over Clara's thick eyelashes, tracking down her cheeks. "Dominic." "I am a violent man, Clara," he confessed, his voice breaking with raw vulnerability. "My soul is stained, but I swear to God, if you stay with me, I will lay the world at your feet. No one will ever disrespect you again. No one will ever make you feel like you aren't a masterpiece." He pulled her down by the lapels of her silk robe. Clara went willingly, collapsing softly against his uninjured side. She buried her face in the crook of his neck, inhaling the scent of cedar, medical alcohol, and the man she had entirely, hopelessly, fallen in love with. "I'm not going anywhere, boss," Clara whispered against his skin, pressing a tender kiss to his jawline, right where she had slapped him weeks ago. "I still have a kitchen to run." Dominic let out a low, rumbling laugh that ended in a groan of pain, but his arms wrapped tightly around her thick waist, anchoring her to him. For the first time in his ruthless life, the Don of Chicago felt entirely at peace. The dawn broke over Lake Michigan, painting the turbulent waters in shades of bruised purple and brilliant gold. Inside the heavily fortified Lake Forest estate, the tense, suffocating silence of the night was finally broken by the crunch of heavy tires on the gravel driveway. Vincenzo Russo stepped out of an unmarked black SUV. Despite the absolute carnage he had orchestrated over the last 8 hours, his tailored suit was completely pristine, a testament to his chilling efficiency. He bypassed the armed perimeter guards and walked directly into Dominic's private mahogany-paneled study. Dominic was seated behind his massive desk, his face pale from blood loss, his ribs tightly bound in thick medical gauze beneath a loose silk shirt. But his dark eyes were sharp, vibrating with lethal energy. Standing right beside his chair, her hand resting protectively on his broad shoulder, was Clara. She had traded her blood-stained chef's coat for one of Dominic's oversized cashmere sweaters, which draped beautifully over her generous curves. Vincenzo stopped in the center of the room and dropped a thick, blood-spattered leather dossier onto the desk. "It's done, boss," Vincenzo reported, his voice devoid of emotion. "Senator Mitchell's private security contractors have been permanently liquidated. We completely drained the offshore shell corporations at Deutsche Bank. The senator was presented with the photographic evidence of his illicit wire transfers. He will be submitting his immediate resignation to the governor by noon, citing sudden health issues." Dominic's jaw clenched, his hand reaching up to cover Clara's soft fingers resting on his shoulder. "And the local facilitator? Who gave Lombardi's men the security clearance to access my kitchen staff?" Vincenzo's lips curled into a rare, cruel sneer. "That was the twist, boss. The security clearance didn't come from Mitchell. It came from Mayor Richard Tremblay. He was using the charity gala as a front to launder Lombardi's money into Chicago. He wanted you dead so he could control the new port contracts without your interference." Clara gasped softly, her mind flashing back to the glittering ballroom of the Grand Astoria Hotel, where Mayor Tremblay had cowered behind a pillar while Dominic's men had drawn their guns on her. Dominic let out a low, dangerous laugh that rumbled in his injured chest. Tremblay. How incredibly poetic. He hosted the gala where I found my queen, and now he is the final loose end. "Do I send the boys to his residence?" Vincenzo asked, his hand resting casually on his holstered weapon. "No," Dominic said softly, his dark eyes locking onto Clara's wide, beautiful face. "Death is far too merciful for a man whose ego is his entire identity. We don't kill Richard Tremblay. We take his city. We take his pride. We take absolutely everything." 2 months later, the brutal, invisible war that had threatened to tear Chicago apart was nothing but a memory. The Castiglione syndicate emerged completely undisputed, their power stretching from the underground docks to the highest corporate high-rises. And standing at the absolute pinnacle of that empire was Clara Higgins. The winter snow was falling heavily outside the arched windows of the Drake Hotel, Chicago's most historic and opulent venue on the Magnificent Mile. The Castiglione family was hosting a grand charity gala, having completely aggressively bought out and absorbed the Tremblay Foundation. The city's elite were gathered in the legendary Gold Coast Room, whispering nervously amongst themselves. The air was electric with anticipation. Clara stood in the lavish penthouse suite, staring at her reflection in the floor-to-ceiling mirror. She was no longer the exhausted, flower-covered baker who tried to make herself invisible. She wore a custom-made emerald green haute couture gown by Christian Siriano. The brilliant designer had crafted the silk and velvet masterpiece specifically to worship her plus-size figure. The corset bodice lifted and showcased her heavy, magnificent bust, while the emerald silk hugged her thick waist and flared beautifully over her wide hips and lush thighs. A cascade of diamonds, a gift from Dominic, rested against her collarbone. She looked utterly regal, a true goddess of wealth and power, taking up exactly as much space as she deserved. Dominic stepped up behind her, dressed in a flawless midnight blue Tom Ford tuxedo. He wrapped his large arms around her thick waist, burying his face in the crook of her neck, inhaling the sweet scent of pure vanilla and expensive perfume. "You are a masterpiece," he murmured against her skin, his dark eyes meeting hers in the mirror, burning with an obsessive, fiercely protective love. "Are you ready to show them who owns this city?" Clara smiled, a brilliant, confident expression that radiated absolute power. "I'm ready, boss." When the double doors of the Gold Coast Room swung open, the entire ballroom froze. 300 of the most powerful people in the state stopped breathing. Dominic Castiglione walked in, the undisputed king of the underworld. But no one was looking at him. Every eye was entirely fixated on the breathtaking, fiercely beautiful, full-figured woman on his arm. They parted the crowd effortlessly. As they reached the center of the room, a waiter approached with a silver tray, carrying 2 crystal flutes of vintage Dom Perignon. The waiter was an older man, his face pale and deeply lined with humiliation, his hands trembling violently under his cheap uniform. It was Richard Tremblay. Dominic had systematically bankrupted him, destroyed his political career, and forced him to work for the catering company serving the gala to pay off a fraction of his insurmountable debts to the syndicate. Tremblay bowed his head, unable to meet Clara's eyes. He held the tray out to the woman whose pastries his political allies had once destroyed and mocked. Clara looked at the disgraced former mayor, feeling no fear, only the quiet, absolute certainty of her own triumph. She took the champagne glass with a graceful, heavily ringed hand. Dominic took his glass, wrapping his free arm tightly around Clara's waist, pulling her plush, magnificent body flush against his. He raised his glass to the silent, terrified room. "To the Queen of Chicago," Dominic declared, his voice echoing with lethal, uncompromising authority. He didn't care about the politicians, the billionaires, or the rival bosses watching them. He turned his head and kissed Clara fiercely in front of everyone, proving to the entire world that the baker who had once slapped the Mafia boss was now the only force on earth that could bring him to his knees. What an unbelievable, pulse-pounding journey from a bullied, exhausted baker to the undisputed queen of the Chicago underworld. Clara proved that true power doesn't come from shrinking yourself to fit society's mold. It comes from boldly owning exactly who you are, generous curves and all. Did you expect Dominic to fall so deeply and fiercely in love? Or were you completely shocked by the violent twists and political betrayals? Let us know your absolute favorite moment in the comments below. If this intense, dramatic Mafia romance kept you on the edge of your seat, please hit that like button, share this video with your fellow drama lovers, and subscribe to our channel for more thrilling, real-life inspired stories. Turn on those notifications so you never miss a twist.